Good afternoon. We are finishing the text Blacks and the Master-Slave Relation today. Before, I just want to make a quick announcement and recap the last class. I will do it very quick. It will be a brief presentation today. So I just want to let you know that next week I will devote 5 or 10 minutes to citations and bibliography as someone who read all your papers. I see that the common problem with your text is you don't really know how to properly cite. So I would like to teach you how to format your citations, since one of the goals of this course is to help you write better papers in general in philosophy. Last Tuesday, we discussed the first part of the interview with Wilderson, and we saw that for Wilderson, anti-Black violence cannot be fully understood with a political or economic framework. It has to be understood with a psychoanalytical perspective, with libidinal economy, which means it comes from some psychic drives, urges, lust, not for economic reason, for work or for producing a certain product. And we also discussed Tuesday that even though Wilderson is a Marxist, calls himself a Marxist, he has an ambivalent relationship with the left or the so-called Marxist analysis of power, because he thinks they are lackluster when it comes to talk about slavery. Slavery is a contradiction in the analysis of power that focuses only on the antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the left now see injustices as just some performance. It's not, it's a kind of shallow analysis of power, surface level analysis of power. So you have some injustices, for example, too low wages or not enough rights for women, or discriminatory policies against Black people or people of color. And so the solution is clear. You have to reform these policies. So you have to increase the wages. You have to give more rights to women. You have to get rid of discriminatory policies. And then everything will be all right. Everybody will be free. And it's wrong, because we see that a few years later, the same problems reappear, and the left people ask themselves why. It's just because they focused on the performances of the oppression instead of the structure of the oppression. But why they choose this analysis is because they are anxious and they need to know what is the solution. They need a clear path, where, as opposed to an Afro-pessimist analysis that leaves you with a lot of questions and not a clear path. As I discussed the criticism against Marxism, one of you asked me to define Marxism. Although it is true that you need a little bit of surface level understanding of Marxism to understand the reasoning, Wilderson reasoning, it's not really a course dedicated to political philosophy or economy. So Marxism here is just, you have to understand that it comes from the realization that workers had deplorable conditions of work, and you had this child labor. So after the Industrial Revolution, and so this idea of oh my God, of alienation of the worker came. So Marxism is a critique of capitalism, and it's also this idea that the mode of production changed the political and social life of people, and they shape the mode of production, shape the consciousness and antagonize new classes. So this new mode of production, new modes of production that comes with the industrialization, antagonize the bourgeoisie, who are the people who owns these modes of productions, and the working class, who are the people who earn wages, people who are forced to sell their labor to make a living. I think so. What you just have to understand from this, understand Marxism for Wilderson. Marxism is an analysis of power that antagonizes two classes, the working class and the bourgeoisie. And the nature of the oppression of the working class comes from the exploitation how the capitalists exploit them. So this is the nature of oppression. This is the nature of alienation. This is the main antagonism in the world for a Marxist. That's all you need to know for my course. Asking me what is Marxism is the same as asking me what is psychoanalysis or what is psychology. I cannot it's not the focus of my goal. You have many ways to understand Marxism, and I use that. I do use the word very often, but it's just the background, just like Lacan psychoanalysis is a background. And of course, you are invited to learn more about Marxism by yourself. These slides came from, by the way, these slides came from Professor Monique Deveau. As a former teaching assistant for her, I had these resources, and she graciously accepted that I share this with you, so you can read it on your own, because that's all I want to say about Marxism. Or maybe you can just read it on your own and I don't need to explain it. So I don't know. But this notion of Marxism came again in the interview. If we go back to the interview, when they discuss Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, who was a Marxist philosopher, and they discuss the difference between Gramsci's analysis and Afro-pessimist analysis, which is that according to Gramsci, you have an ordinary violence that forces people to obey and work. And then you have this notion of consent that came from the leader class, because the consent came from ideology. For example, the meritocracy. So if you work hard, you will be on top too. So as if people who are rich deserve to be rich because they work so hard. So this is an ideology that comes from the leading class, and that makes the working class more submissive. So therefore, they don't need violence anymore. The leading class does not need that much violence because they have this people, they were able to obtain consent from the working class with this ideology that they diffuse in the talk shows, for example. But with slavery, you never had this notion of consent that come into play, according to Wilderson. Yes, there is this originary violence, but the violence stays there. It's not, there's no moment where the violence disappears, because violence has other purposes. Violence is not only utilitarian. It's not only to force people to obey and work for you. It's also for pleasure. And the example that Wilderson provides to prove that point is slavery in the US, when the slaveholder beat up enslaved person, it was done with pleasure, with his wife and with his kids. They all participate in the beatings of the enslaved person. And that makes that family stabilize. The psychic life of the family stabilize with this beating up of the enslaved person. In the interview, they also discussed a little bit the difference between Black people and people from First Nations. And so, yes, there is a genocide in the US and Canada. US, they talk about US, I think. And so they killed Native people, First Nation people. But for Wilderson, this extreme violence had an utilitarian purpose. which is to gain the land of the First Nations. So they get rid of the population to get their land, which is different than the violence against Black people. Again, physical and social death of Black people has some regenerative purposes. And the example he gave earlier in the interview was from slavery and social death, when the community decides to put one person socially dead. So this person has no ties with the community anymore, is alienated. And when they do that, when the Choctaw community does that, they reinforce their bonds. So as if we need to sacrifice someone to stabilize or reinforce the bonds between a community. So social death of Black people. Dred Scott was an example. The verdict, so Dred Scott was an enslaved person who was freed by his slaveholder. And then so Dred Scott left the state and he lived like a free man in another state in the US. But then the slaveholder died, and the family of the slaveholder decided that they needed Dred Scott to come back and be an enslaved person again. And Dred Scott was able to put this case in the court to prevent this family to enslave them again. And so the decision at the end, when they went to Supreme Court, was that Dred Scott was not even a human being to even be in front of the tribunal and the court to dispute the case, since he comes from Africa. His ancestors come from Africa, which is a land where non-human beings live. So in that case, it's fair for the family to take him back as an enslaved person. So Dred Scott was, even though he was freed by his slaveholder, he was not really freed in this community, and he was still socially dead. As a socially dead person, it is acceptable to take him back to slavery. And finally, the journalist questions Wilderson on this idea that Afro-pessimist movement promotes a victimhood framework, a no agency framework, which means Black people are victims, they are enslaved, and there's nothing they can do about it. Their future is already overdetermined. Overdetermined by their past and their present. Black people are slaves. And Wilderson disagrees with that diagnosis, with this evaluation of his theory. In contrary, he says that Afro-pessimism promotes the destruction of categories that makes an identity. And this is a violent process, a violent deconstruction. It cannot be experienced differently than violence for the non-Black people, because it involves non-Black people. It requires non-Black people to get rid of everything that makes up their identity, which is their religion, their gender, their nationality, their culture. Just to live the way, just to feel the way a Black person feels every day, how they are policed. Because a Black person is policed by, the way he's policed is determined by his skin color and nothing else. It doesn't matter where these people, these Black people came from, doesn't matter their religion, it doesn't matter their gender, sorry. You are a Black person, your future is overdetermined by your skin color. So in this sense, for Wilderson, he thinks that Afro-Pessimism promotes agency. But of course, even though he is a Marxist person, it's clear that abolishing capitalism will not make automatically Black people free. What does freedom look like? It's a question. We don't know. So in the interview, what we learn is that it's not really about fighting capitalism. It's more fighting the categories that makes you a person. That's what we learned in this interview. But it's a good question, since we know that Wilderson was Marxist. Does he think that a free society is a society in which capitalism is absent and Black people are free? Or Black people can be free and capitalism still exists? I think it's a research question, in the sense that you have to read everything that Wilderson wrote to understand this, to answer this question. And I do not think that I'm able to answer, or that we are able to answer the question just with the required readings that we have in our outline. But what is clear is that abolishing capitalism won't make necessarily Black people free. That's for sure. I hope it helps. So next week, we discuss the first part of the prison slave as hegemony scandal. So now we are really, next week, we will start really read the Wilderson's text, and it will become increasingly more and more challenging. It's hard. So you have to be really focused and read slowly. Thank you.